Deadwood, Dakota Territory, high noon, the summer of 1878. Don't touch her. The stranger's voice was low and ragged, barely louder than the dry wind sweeping across the schoolyard. Yet Slade's leather-gloved fist stopped only inches from Evelyn Vance's face. For one breathless moment, nobody moved. 8 terrified children huddled behind the schoolhouse stove, watching through the open doorway. Evelyn stood on the porch steps, her face pale but defiant, placing her small body between them and 5 armed men wearing Blackwood mining badges. Slade slowly turned toward the barn. A ragged drifter stepped from the shadows. His coat was torn, his boots were tied together with twine, and one hand pressed against the dark blood, soaking his ribs. He looked like a dead man, refusing to lie down. Then Slade's gang erupted in laughter. "You lost, old man," Slade sneered, his cruel smile returning. "Crawl back into that barn before I make you dig your own grave." The stranger took another painful step forward. His face tightened with agony, but his cold eyes never left Slade. "I said, don't touch her." Slade's smile vanished. "You think one crippled beggar can stand against 5 guns?" His hand dropped toward his holster. Evelyn's breath caught. Behind her, a little boy began to cry. Slade drew. 4 deafening gunshots tore through the noon air. A revolver shattered. 2 rifles spun from their owner's hands. Another outlaw crashed face first into the dust as the heel of his boot exploded beneath him. Then silence. The gang's laughter was gone. Slade knelt in the dirt, clutching his bleeding hand, staring at the stranger with naked terror. "Get off her land," the drifter said, smoke curling from the barrel of his Colt. "You re-dead," Slade screamed. "Hiram Blackwood will bury you." The stranger cocked the hammer. "Tell him to try." The outlaws fled. But as the dust settled, the stranger's hand began to shake. His deadly stare faded. He missed his holster twice, then collapsed face first into the dirt. Evelyn rushed to him and tore open his coat. Beneath it was a bullet wound, so deep and blood-soaked that he should have died long before entering her yard. "You hold on," she whispered fiercely, pressing both hands against the wound. "You fought for us. Now fight for yourself." But who was this dying gunslinger, and why had he used the last of his strength to protect a schoolteacher and 8 children Deadwood had already abandoned? To understand how a nameless drifter became the final shield between Hope Ranch and Hiram Blackwood's empire, we must return to the day. Silas Thorne stepped out of the shadows. The chalk snapped in half. Evelyn Vance didn't flinch. She just picked up the larger piece from the floor, dusted off her apron, and kept writing on the slate board. A stands for apple. B stands for brave. "Miss Evelyn," little Toby whispered. His voice was shaking. "Keep your eyes on your slates." "Children," she said. Her voice was steady. It had to be. Outside the open window of the Hope Ranch schoolhouse, the sound of hooves was getting louder. Too loud and too many. This wasn't a friendly visit. Evelyn set the chalk down. She turned to face her class. 8 kids sat at the wooden desks. Some were orphans. Some were the children of poor miners. Toby was a young black boy who had escaped a forced labor camp just 2 counties over. Sarah was a little girl with a limp, cast out by her own folks. To Deadwood, they were outcasts. To Evelyn, they were the future. "Pencils down," Evelyn said softly. "Move to the back wall. Stay behind the stove." The children scrambled quietly. They knew the drill. Trouble was a regular guest in Deadwood. Evelyn walked out the front door and stepped onto the wooden porch. The midday sun beat down hard, baking the Dakota dust. 5 men rode into the yard. They didn't bother slowing down until their horses were practically stepping on Evelyn's flower beds. They all wore heavy canvas coats, and every one of them wore a tin badge stamped with the words Blackwood Mining. At the front was Slade. Folks called him Mad Dog. He had a face like beaten leather and a smile that made your stomach turn. Well, well, look at this, Slade sneered. He spit a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt. School's in session. You're trespassing. Slade, Evelyn said. She didn't cross her arms. She kept her hands loose at her sides. Mr. Blackwood sent us. Sweetheart, Slade said, leaning over the horn of his saddle. He says your time is up. He wants the deed to this land. The railroad is coming through, and your little orphanage is sitting right on his tracks. I told Hiram last week, and I'll tell you today, the land isn't for sale. Slade chuckled, a nasty grating sound. He swung his heavy frame down from his horse. His boots hit the ground with a dull thud. His men followed suit, spreading out across the yard. Their hands rested easy on their gun belts. Blackwood don't like you, Evelyn, Slade said, walking slowly toward the porch. He don't like you taking in these strays. And he sure as hell don't like you teaching them how to read. They have a right to learn, Evelyn said clearly. Her voice carried across the yard. Every human being has a right to an education. A mind that can read is a mind that is free. Slade stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at her with pure disgust. A book won't save a mine rat. Slade's bet. They're property, born for the dark. Giving them ideas just makes them dangerous. It makes them your equal, Evelyn shot back. And that's what terrifies Hiram Blackwood. Slade's face flushed red. The smile vanished. I'm done talking to you, woman. He took a heavy step up the stairs. Evelyn didn't back away. She stepped forward. She placed her body squarely between Slade and the open door of the schoolhouse. She was small, but she stood like a wall of iron. She was ready to take a beating, if it meant keeping him away from those kids. Slade raised a heavy, leather-gloved hand. He pulled his arm back, aiming right for her jaw. Don't touch her. The voice didn't shout. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the hot air like a rusted blade. It was raw, tired, and completely devoid of fear. Slade froze. He turned his head. His men turned, too, hands gripping their holsters. A man stepped out from the deep shadows of the barn. He looked like a corpse that had decided to go for a walk. His duster was torn and caked in dried mud. His boots were held together with baling twine. A ragged, dark beard covered half his face. He leaned heavily to his left side, clutching his ribs under the coat. But his eyes were alive. They were cold, gray, and dead-focused on Slade. Slade stared at the ragged drifter. Then he looked back at his boys. They started laughing. It was a cruel, roaring laugh. The sound of bullies who knew they had the numbers. 5 armed men against one crippled, nameless beggar. You lost, old man, Slade sneered, dropping his hand from Evelyn and turning fully toward the yard. You better crawl back into that hay before I make you dig your own grave. The drifter didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just took one agonizing step forward. I said, don't touch. Her Slade's eyes narrowed. I'll touch who I want, and I'll put you in the ground first. Slade's hand dropped to his holster. The gang laughed harder, and then the shooting started. It wasn't a duel. It was an execution of pride. Nobody saw the drifter draw. 1 second, his hands were hanging empty at his sides. The next, a heavy Colt .45 was in his right hand, spitting fire and thunder. Bang! Slade's gun shattered just as it cleared leather. The sheer force of the bullet ripped the heavy iron from his grip, tearing his fingers. Slade screamed, falling to his knees. Bang! Bang! 2 of Slade's men cried out. Their rifles spun out of their hands. The wooden stocks splintered into matchsticks. Bang! The heel of the 4th man's boot exploded in a cloud of dust and leather. He crashed face first into the dirt, bawling like a child. 4 shots, barely 2 seconds. The laughing stopped. The only sound left in the yard was the ringing in their ears and the heavy, sulfur smell of gun smoke hanging in the still air. The drifter stood perfectly still. The barrel of his Colt smoked in the sunlight. He hadn't killed them. He had surgically disarmed them in the blink of an eye. It was a terrifying display of control. "Get off her land," the drifter said. His voice was still quiet, still steady. Slade was on his knees in the dirt, clutching his bleeding, mangled hand. He looked up at the stranger. The mockery was gone. Total, absolute terror had taken its place. "This wasn't a beggar. This was a demon. You're dead," Slade stammered, spitting dust. "Hiram Blackwood will kill you for this." "Tell him to try," the drifter said. He cocked the hammer back. The mechanical click echoed loudly. Slade didn't wait. He scrambled to his feet. He didn't check on his men. He just grabbed his horse's reins with his good hand, hauled himself up, and rode hard toward the town line. The others dragged themselves out of the dirt and followed, kicking up a storm of dust in their desperate hurry to get away. The yard went dead quiet again. Evelyn stood frozen on the porch. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She looked back into the schoolhouse. The children were huddled behind the stove, wide-eyed, but untouched. Safe, she turned her gaze back to the stranger in the yard. The drifter slowly lowered his gun. He tried to slide it back into his holster. He missed the leather twice. His hand was shaking violently. The cold, deadly focus vanished from his eyes. His shoulders slumped. Then his knees buckled. He hit the dirt hard, face down, and didn't move. Evelyn ran down the porch steps. She didn't care that he was a stranger. She didn't care that he was clearly a dangerous man. He had just risked his life for people he didn't even know. She dropped to her knees in the dirt beside him and grabbed his shoulder, rolling him over. His coat fell open. His shirt was soaked in blood. Thick, dark, old blood. He had been gut shot long before he ever walked out of that barn. He had used the absolute last ounce of his strength just to pull that trigger. "Toby," Evelyn yelled toward the schoolhouse. "Fetch the doctor's kit. Now." She pressed her hands tightly against the stranger's chest, feeling the weak, fluttering beat of his heart. "You hold on," Evelyn whispered fiercely, staring into his pale, unconscious face. "You fought for us. Now you fight for yourself. You hear me? Hold on." The smell of boiling vinegar and wild sage woke him. Silas Thorne didn't open his eyes. He didn't move a muscle. He lay perfectly still, listening. He counted the breaths of the person in the room. One, soft, regular, a woman's breath. He felt the rough weave of a cotton sheet against his skin. Underneath that, a mattress stuffed with corn husks. It didn't smell like a grave. It smelled like a home. "I know you're awake," a voice said. It was her, the schoolteacher. Evelyn, Silas let out a long, ragged sigh and opened his eyes. The ceiling was made of rough-hewn pine logs. Sunlight streamed through a small window, cutting a bright path through the dust motes in the air. He tried to sit up, but a white-hot iron spike drove straight into his flank. He grunted, slamming back down. "Don't do that," Evelyn said, stepping into his line of sight. She was carrying a bowl of steaming water and a clean rag. "The bullet passed clean through, but it chewed up your ribs. You bleed out again, and I'm out of clean sheets." She set the bowl on a small, three-legged stool beside the bed. She didn't look at him with fear. She didn't look at him with pity. She just looked at him like a problem that needed solving. "Where's my iron?" Silas rasped. His throat felt like it was coated in sand. "Under the floorboards," she said, wringing out the cloth, "where it can't do any more harm until you're fit to carry it. Drink this." She held a tin cup of water to his lips. He drank greedily, the cool water soothing his burning throat. When she leaned in to wipe his brow, he caught the faint scent of lye soap and lavender. It was a clean smell. A good smell. It had been years since he'd been close enough to a decent person to smell anything but stale whiskey and black powder. "Why did you do it?" Evelyn asked. She sat on the edge of the stool and began unbuttoning his shirt to check the dressing. Do what? Step out of that barn. You were half dead already. Slade would have killed you if you missed. Silas looked away, staring at the pine ceiling. He was going to hit you. I can take a blow. A man who strikes a woman because she's smaller ain't a man, Silas said. His voice was flat, a statement of fact. He's a beast. The world's got too many beasts. Evelyn stopped her hands. She looked down at him, her dark eyes searching his face. He had a map of scars on his chest-old knife wounds, a jagged line from an Apache arrow, and the fresh, ugly purple hole from a Winchester ball. "You fought a lot of them," she murmured, gently peeling back the poultice. "And I lost," Silas said. "You didn't lose yesterday. Yesterday was just noise." Evelyn didn't argue. She cleaned the wound with a steady, practiced hand, every time the vinegar stung his flesh. Silas clenched his jaw until his teeth cracked, but he didn't make a sound. He had borne worse. By afternoon, the fever came back, riding him like a bad horse. Silas drifted in and out of the dark. In the dark, the ghosts were waiting. He saw his wife, Clara, standing in the doorway of their old home in Wyoming. He saw his little boy, Billy, running through the tall grass. Then the fire came, the screaming, the men with the tin badges laughing while the house burned to the ground. "Silas, help us," Clara screamed. He reached for his gun, but his holster was empty. He was running through mud, his legs heavy as lead. The fire growing hotter, consuming everything. "Easy," a voice whispered. "Easy, Silas. You're safe. The fire is out." A cool hand pressed against his burning forehead. The screaming faded. The smell of smoke turned back into the smell of vinegar and sage. He opened his eyes, trembling, soaked in sweat. Evelyn was sitting beside him. It was dark outside now. A single tallow candle burned on the table, casting long, soft shadows against the log walls. She was holding his hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong for such a small woman. "They're gone," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. "Who, my folks? The law killed them." He didn't know why he was telling her. The fever was pulling the truth out of his chest like a bad tooth. "I was the sheriff. I trusted the rules. I trusted the judges. But the gold men bought the town. They wanted the valley. When I wouldn't sign the eviction orders, they burned my world down while I was out outlaws hunting." Evelyn didn't look away. She just squeezed his hand tighter. "So you became a ghost," she said softly. "A ghost with a gun," Silas muttered. "I've been hunting the men who did it for 4 years. Hiram Blackwood was one of the investors. He moved his money down here to Deadwood. I followed the blood trail, and you found us instead," Evelyn said. "I found a school teacher who don't know when to run." Evelyn let out a small, dry laugh. She let go of his hand and stood up, walking over to the window. She looked out into the Black Dakota night. "My father was a slave in Virginia," she said. Her back was to him, but her voice was as clear as a bell. "He didn't have a name. He didn't have a birthday. He was just a piece of property on a ledger book. But an old Quaker man secretly taught him how to read the Bible. That Quaker man was hanged for it." Silas listened, the fever humming in his ears. "Before my father died, he told me something," Evelyn continued. Turning to face him, he said, "Evelyn, the white man can take your labor. He can take your land. He can even take your life. But if you can read, he can't take your mind. A man who can think for himself is a man who can never truly be enslaved." She walked back to the bed and looked down at Silas. "That's why I don't run," she said. "Hiram Blackwood wants to turn this whole territory into his personal kingdom. He wants the miners dependent on his stores. He wants the children ignorant so they grow up to be cheap muscle in his dark holes. If I leave, the light goes out in this valley." Silas looked at her, really looked at her. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have a badge. But she had a core of pure, unyielding steel. "A gun can only kill an enemy, Silas," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "It can't build a tomorrow. These children need to know their rights. They need to know that under God's son, a poor man's child has the exact same worth as a millionaire's son. That's what I am building here. and I'll die before I let Blackwood tear it down. Silas felt something shift deep inside his chest. It wasn't the fever. It was something colder. Older, a spark of the man he used to be, before the fire took his soul. "You're a foolish woman, Evelyn Vance," he muttered, "and you're a miserable patient." "Silas Thorne," she replied, a tiny smile touching her lips. "Now sleep. Tomorrow, the children have a lesson, and you're going to listen." The next morning, the room was filled with the sound of scraping pencils. Silas was propped up against a couple of pillows. He was weak, but the fever had broken. The bedroom door was left open, giving him a clear view into the main schoolroom. 6 children were sat at the long benches. Evelyn stood by the blackboard, pointing a wooden stick at a list of words. "Toby," she said, nodding to the young black boy, "read the 3rd line for me." Toby stood up. His trousers were patched at both knees, but his shirt was clean. He swallowed hard, his fingers twisting the hem of his vest. He looked at the board, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. "All men are created equal," Toby read, his voice stumbling over the syllables but pushing through to the end. "Good," Evelyn said, her face lighting up with a proud warmth. "Now, what does that mean?" "Toby, it means Mr. Blackwood ain't the boss of my soul," the boy said clearly. "It means my skin don't make me lesser than him. The law says I got a right to my own life." "That's exactly right," Evelynson said. "The law of the land might be broken sometimes, but the truth doesn't change. No man has the right to own another man as labor through force or fear. Remember that." Silas watched the boy sit down. He looked at the other children. They were listening like their lives depended on it. And maybe they did. A shadow fell over the bed. Silas looked up. A tall, broad-shouldered black man in a dark frock coat was standing in the doorway. He had kind, sorrowful eyes and a thick gray beard. "The name is Elias," the man said, holding out a large, calloused hand. "Reverend Elias." Silas took the hand. The grip was firm. "Silas, I saw what you did to Slater's crew," Elias said, pulling up a chair and sitting down. "Never seen a man move that fast with an iron. You saved Miss Evelyn a lot of grief. Slade will be back," Silas said. "Kicked dogs always come back with more teeth." "We know," Elias said softly. He leaned in, his voice dropping so the children wouldn't hear. "But we aren't entirely helpless. Mr. Silas, Evelyn teaches them the theory of freedom. I work on the practice." "What's that mean?" Elias smiled darkly. "You think this is just a ranch? Come dawn, when you can walk, I'll show you what. Ask under the floorboards in the cellar. It ain't just potatoes." Silas looked past the preacher to where Evelyn was helping a little girl write her letters. She was holding the child's small hand, guiding the pencil across the slate with infinite patience. Truth. Silas closed his eyes. For 4 years, his world had been defined by the caliber of his bullets and the distance to the next town. But in this small cabin, surrounded by outcasts and orphans, the world suddenly felt a whole lot bigger and a whole lot harder to leave. The wagon was empty. Pete, the older white ranch hand, who had been with Evelyn's father before the fever took him, climbed down from the buckboard. His face was gray with dust and defeat. Evelyn walked out to the yard, Silas leaning heavily on a cedar crutch, just a step behind her. "Nothing?" Evelyn asked. "Nothing, Miss Evelyn," Pete said, spitting into the dirt. "Old man Miller at the general store wouldn't even look me in the eye," said Hiram Blackwood. "Bought up every sack of flour, every side of bacon, and every jar of quinine in the county. Said if he sells so much as a box of salt to Hope Ranch, Blackwood will cancel his freight contract and ruin him by winter." "What about the apothecary?" Evelyn's voice remained steady, but Silas saw her fingers tighten into white knots against her apron. "Locked up tight," Pete muttered. "Blackwood put 2 guards at the door. They're calling it an inventory check. It's a siege, Miss Evelyn. He's gonna starve us out." The children were gathered on the porch, watching silently. They weren't crying. Children of the frontier learned early that hunger was just another predator. like the wolves or the winter freeze. Silas spat a bit of hay from his mouth. Told you. A kicked dog comes back with more teeth. Blackwood ain't using lead this time. He using the winter. We have 2 weeks of cornmeal left, Evelyn said, turning her fierce gaze to Silas. And 3 children who still need their cough medicine. I won't let them go hungry because one man wants to play king. Then we go hunting, Silas said, patting the stock of the Winchester rifle Pete had brought out from the house. Deer don't check with Blackwood before they cross the ridge. Hunting will fill the bellies for a week, Mr. Thorne, Reverend Elias said, stepping out from the cellar doors at the side of the house. His apron was stained with thick, black smudges. But it won't fix the root of the rot. Come here, both of you. It's time you see the cellar. Silas followed Evelyn and the preacher down the dark wooden steps. The air below was cool and damp, smelling of earth and turnips. But as they walked deeper, past the rows of preserved squash, the smell changed. It became sharp, chemical, and metallic. Elias pulled a canvas tarp off a massive, heavy iron contraption sitting in the center of the earthen room. It had a large lever, a flat bed, and rows of small lead blocks set into wooden trays. Silas stared at it. A printing press, a Washington hand press, Elias corrected, his eyes gleaming in the lantern light. My grandfather was a printer in Philadelphia before the war. I smuggled this piece by piece out of St. Louis. Blackwood thinks he controls the truth because he bought the Deadwood newspaper. He thinks if nobody talks about his crimes, they don't exist. Evelyn stepped up to the press, her hand gently tracing the iron frame. Hiram isn't just a mining baron, Silas. He's running an illegal labor ring. He waits for the immigrant trains in Omaha, promises poor Irish and German families good jobs in the West, and then signs them into contracts they can't read. Once they get to Deadwood, he locks them in the camps. He charges them for food, for tools, for shelter, until they owe him their souls. It's slavery by another name. Silas felt a familiar coldness wash over him, and the law allows it. The local judge is Blackwood's brother-in-law, Elias said bitterly. The territorial governor is 500 miles away in Yankton and don't care as long as the gold shipments arrive on time. But if we can print the truth, if we can print the actual names of the men held in those mines, the ledger figures of their forced debts, and get it to the federal marshals, the law will have to move. That takes time, Silas said, leaning on his crutch, and Blackwood S. got shooters. You start circulating a rogue paper, and he won't just starve you. He burned this valley to cinder. Then let him try, Evelyn said. She turned to Silas, her face inches from his. The lantern light caught the amber flecks in her dark eyes. I'm not asking you to fight my war, Silas Thorne. You're a man running from his own grave. But don't tell me to be quiet. Silence is the dirt they bury us in. Silas looked at her, really looked at her. She was terrified. He could see the tiny tremor in her lower lip, but she wasn't backing down. She was standing up for people who couldn't even read the words she was trying to print for them. You're a stubborn woman, Silas muttered. And you're still breathing, she replied, which means you still have work to do. By evening, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose shingles on the schoolhouse roof. Silas sat on the porch, his leg feeling stronger now. He had discarded the crutch for a stout oak walking stick. He spent the last 2 hours cleaning his Colt .45, checking every spring, every screw. The weapon was a part of him, an extension of his own broken will. Evelyn came out, carrying a small bowl of hot broth. She sat down on the bench beside him, smoothing her skirts. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars come out over the jagged black teeth of the ridge. You should leave, Silas, she said softly. Silas didn't look up from his gun. You changing your mind about my company? No, she said, her voice dropping. But Pete saw Slade's scouts on the North Trail an hour ago. They're watching the roads. Blackwood knows you're here. He knows you're the one who broke Slade's fingers. If you leave now, under the dark, you can make the Montana border before they realize you're gone. Silas set the cylinder back into the frame of the Colt. The sharp click, click, click of the iron was the only sound against the wind. I spent 4 years running. Evelyn, he said quietly, every time I closed my eyes, I saw the fire. I thought if I killed the men who did it, the fire would go out. But it don't. The killing just adds more wood to the furnace. He turned his head to look at her. The starlight caught the gentle curve of her cheek, the soft, dark coil of her hair. But yesterday, Silas continued, his voice rough, with an emotion he hadn't felt in a lifetime, when I saw you stand in front of that door, when I saw you ready to take a bullet for those kids. The fire stopped for a minute, for the first time in 4 years. The smoke cleared. Evelyn looked at him, her breath hitching. Silas, I ain't a good man, Evelyn, he said, reaching out. His calloused, scarred hand hesitated for a fraction of a second before gently cupping her chin. Her skin was incredibly soft, warm against his cold fingers. My hands are full of blood, but if I ride away now, I am leaving the only decent thing I've found since my boy died. I ain't going to Montana. Evelyn didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes shining with unshed tears. We might not survive this, Silas, she whispered. Hiram Blackwood has 30 guns. Then he is going to need 30 more, Silas said. He leaned in slowly. He gave her time to move, time to push him back into the dark where he belonged. But she didn't. She closed her eyes and tilted her face up. Their lips met in the cool night air. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, fierce, and heavy with the weight of two lonely people who knew tomorrow might bring a bullet. It tasted of salt, of survival, and of a strange, beautiful hope that had no business growing in a place like Deadwood. When he pulled back, her cheeks were flushed, her breathing ragged. She looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time, not as a ghost, but as a living, bleeding man. We need to print those pages, she said, her voice shaking but determined. Then let's get to work, Silas said, standing up. He tucked the Colt into his waistband. His side still ached, but the weakness was gone. He had a reason to stand. At midnight, the cellar was alive with the rhythmic clack-thump of the hand press. Silas pulled the heavy iron lever, his muscles straining against the weight, pressing the damp paper onto the inked lead blocks. Elias stood on the other side, carefully peeling the printed sheets away and hanging them on a string to dry. Evelyn sat at the small wooden desk, her pen flying across a ledger, translating the rough notes Elias had smuggled out of the mines into clear, readable English. Listen to this, Evelyn said, looking up from her work. Her face was smudged with black ink, but her eyes were bright. Carl Schmidt arrived from Bremen, May 1874. Debt for passage, $80. Current debt on Blackwood S. ledger after 2 years of mining, $340. Charge for shovel rental, 10 cents a day. Charge for blasting powder, 50 cents a pound. She slammed the book shut, her jaw tight with righteous fury. He says stealing their lives through arithmetic, she said, her voice echoing in the cellar. He keeps them illiterate, so they can't read the receipts. They don't even know they're being robbed. It's an abomination against human dignity. The law states a contract signed under deception is null and void. Every one of these men is free under United States law, if they only had a court to say it. They'll have their court, Silas said, grabbing the lever for the next press. We print 50 copies of this. I'll ride through the night and deliver them directly to the federal marshal in Cheyenne myself. The trails are blocked, Silas, Elias warned, setting another sheet on the line. Slade's boys are hungry, and they want blood. Let them watch the trails, Silas said, a cold, deadly smile spreading across his face. I spent 10 years scouting for the Union Army before I ever wore a star. I know paths in these hills that the deer haven't even found yet. Suddenly, the wooden cellar doors above them rattled violently. Thud, thud, thud. Silas blew out the lantern instantly, plunging the room into pitch blackness. In the silence, The only sound was the heavy thumping of his own heart and the slide of his colt clearing leather. "Miss Evelyn," a voice yelled from the top of the stairs. It was Pete. His voice was frantic. "Miss Evelyn, come quick. The North Ridge. It's on fire." The air in the cellar turned cold the moment the doors slammed open. Pete stood at the top of the stairs, his breathing ragged, a lantern swinging wildly in his hand. "The North Ridge," he gasped, wiping sweat and ash from his forehead. They fired the timber. "The wind is pushing the flames right toward the valley trail." Silas didn't move. He kept his colt leveled at the doorway until he recognized the old ranch hand's face. Slowly, he lowered the hammer. "They aren't trying to burn the house," Silas said, his voice flat and calm against the panic in the room. "Not yet. They're cutting off the back way. They want us boxed in." Evelyn stepped past him, her boots clicking sharply on the earthen floor. She didn't hesitate. She climbed the stairs into the cool night air, Silas and Elias following close behind. To the north, the sky was bleeding. A long, jagged line of orange fire crawled across the crest of the ridge, swallowing the pine trees and sending thick plumes of black smoke into the starlight. The wind howled, carrying the faint, bitter scent of burning pitch. "They're forcing our hand," Elias said, his large hands gripping the porch railing until the old wood groaned. "They know we can't winter here without that back trail for foraging. If the valley burns, Hope Ranch is done." "The ranch isn't done until I say it is." Evelyn shot back. She turned to face the two men, her jaw set hard. "Elias, go back to the press. We have 20 sheets dried. Keep rolling until the ink runs out. Silas, help Pete hitch the horses. We need to move the children down to the creek bed before the smoke gets too thick." "And the papers?" Silas asked. "They come with us," she said. "Every single line. Down in the cellar." The rhythmic clack-thump of the Washington hand press started up again. Faster now, a steady heartbeat against the roaring wind outside. Silas worked in the dim light, his side aching with every pull of the heavy lever. He didn't complain. He watched Evelyn across the room. She was stacking the dried proof sheets into a heavy leather satchel, her movements precise, efficient. "Carl Schmidt," she muttered, reading a fresh page as she packed it. "They have his name spelled wrong on Blackwood S-Ledger. They call him Smith. A man travels across the ocean, leaves his home behind, and they steal his very name just to make him easier to track on a balance sheet. It's what they do." "Evelyn," Silas said, leaning his weight into the press lever. "They take a man's name, then they take his pride. Once a man forgets who he is, he'll dig any hole you tell him to. Then we give them their names back," she said, looking up at him. The lantern light caught the fierce, unyielding determination in her eyes. "This text isn't just evidence for a judge, Silas. It's a declaration. When a man reads his own true name on a piece of paper, and he sees the numbers laid out plain and honest, he realizes he isn't property. He realizes the law is supposed to protect his dignity, not Hiram Blackwood's wallet." She stepped closer to the press, handing Silas a fresh sheet of paper. Her fingers brushed against his, warm and steady. "That's what the Constitution means, Silas," she said softly, her voice dropping below the rumble of the fire outside. "It isn't a piece of paper for the politicians in Washington to hide behind. It has a promise. A promise that every human soul has a right to be free from tyranny, whether that tyrant wears a crown or a mining baron's silk vest. If we don't teach these men to read the promise dies." Silas took the paper. He looked at the bold, black ink. He couldn't remember the last time he'd thought about the law as anything other than a weapon used to break his life. But listening to her, watching her protect those neat rows of type like they were living flesh, made him feel the weight of the silver star he used to wear. "You talk like a judge." "Evelyn Vance," Silas muttered, a faint trace of a smile hidden in his beard. "Somebody has to," she said, tapping the leather satchel. "The actual judges in Deadwood are too busy counting Blackwood's gold. By 3 in the morning, the air in the yard was heavy with gray ash. The children were huddled in the back of the buckboard, wrapped in woolen blankets, their small faces pale but silent. Toby sat at the front, holding the reins, his knuckles white. He didn't look at the red sky to the north. He kept his eyes on Evelyn. "We go by the East Creek bed," Silas told Pete, strapping a Winchester rifle to the scabbard on his saddle. "The smoke will stay high over the water. If Slade's scouts are on the main road, they won't see us through the willow brush." "What about you, Silas?" Evelyn asked, stepping off the porch with the heavy satchel slung over her shoulder. "I'll ride parallel on the ridge trail," he said, checking the cylinder of his Colt. "If anyone tries to drop down on the wagon, they have to look up at me first." Evelyn reached out, her hand resting on his stirrup leather. "Don't go looking for a fight." "Silas Thorne, I don't have to look," he said, looking down at her through the hazy air. "In Deadwood, the fight usually finds you before you can even get your boots on." He touched the brim of his hat, turned his horse, and disappeared into the gray, swirling smoke of the timberline. The water in the creek was black as oil under the midnight sky. Evelyn guided the wagon slowly through the shallow gravel bed, the iron-rimmed wheels crunching softly against the stones. The willow branches swept against the canvas sides of the buckboard like reaching fingers. Every few minutes, a gust of wind would drop a fresh blanket of gray ash over the horses' manes, making the team snort and pull against the traces. "Steady, boys," Toby whispered from the seat beside her. He was doing his best to hold the team straight, but he was only 12, and the smell of the distant fire was making the horses wild. "You're doing fine, Toby," Evelyn said, her hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "Keep their heads down. Watch the water line, up on the ridge trail." Silas rode through the burning haze. The fire had skipped the lower draw, but the heat was intense, a heavy, pressing weight that made his chest burn with every breath. He kept his horse at a steady walk, his eyes scanning the brush below. He could see the pale white shape of the wagon canvas moving through the willows every now and then. Suddenly, his horse pricked its ears forward. A low, sharp nickering came from the dense scrub oak 20 yards ahead. Silas didn't hesitate. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the dirt, his boots making no sound in the thick layer of ash. He pulled the Winchester from its scabbard, his thumb resting easy on the hammer. A twig snapped. "I told you. He's down in the creek," a rough voice muttered from the brush. "Slade said to watch the water. Slade ain't here, and my eyes are full of smoke." Another voice grumbled. "Let's just fire the willow patch and let the smoke do the work." Silas didn't warn them. He didn't call out for a surrender. This wasn't a town with a jailhouse anymore. This was a slaughterhouse, and these men were the butcher's dogs. He stepped out from behind a charred pine stump and leveled the rifle. Bang! The first shooter didn't even get his hand to his belt. The heavy lead ball caught him square in the shoulder, lifting him off his feet and dropping him into the dry brush. "Ambush," the second man screamed, rolling behind a boulder and wild firing a short-barreled shotgun into the smoke. The blast tore through the leaves above Silas's head, showering him with hot pine needles. Silas didn't blink. He worked the lever of the Winchester, the mechanical clack-clack, sharp and rhythmic. Bang! The bullet struck the top of the boulder, spraying a cloud of white stone chips directly into the shooter's face. The man cried out, clutching his blinded eyes, his shotgun tumbling into the dirt. Down in the creek bed, Evelyn heard the shots echo through the canyon. "Toby, take the kids into the deep wash under the bank," she ordered, swinging herself down from the wagon seat before the vehicle had even stopped. She reached into the back and pulled out her father's old double-barreled 12-gauge. "Miss Evelyn, don't go up there," Toby cried, his voice breaking. "Stay with the children." "Toby," she said, her voice dropping into that cold, clear tone she used when the schoolroom got out of hand. "If anyone comes down that bank who isn't Silas, you pull that trigger on the small rifle. You understand me." The boy nodded, his chin trembling. Evelyn scrambled up the slippery dirt bank, her skirts catching on the briars, the heavy satchel of papers banging against her hip. The air at the top of the draw was thick enough to choke a mule. She could see the muzzle flashes through the gray fog, too sharp. Orange streaks of lightning up on the ridge trail. A man came crashing through the willow brush just 10 feet in front of her. It was one of Slade's scouts, his coat torn, a bleeding gash across his cheek. He saw Evelyn, and his eyes went wide with a nasty, desperate look. He raised a rusted revolver. Boom. The 12-gauge roared, the heavy recoil, slamming Evelyn back against a cottonwood trunk. She didn't miss. The blast caught the man's arm, sending his pistol flying into the dark water. He stumbled backward, howling, and collapsed into the mud. Silas came sliding down the loose shale bank a second later, his Winchester smoking, his face black with soot. He took one look at the man in the mud, then looked at Evelyn, who was already shoving a fresh red shell into the smoking breech of her shotgun. "You're a dangerous woman, Evelyn Vance," Silas said, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. "I told you," she whispered, her hands shaking as she clicked the gun shut. "I'm not leaving my tomorrow to these beasts. We need to move," Silas said, grabbing her elbow. "The shooting will bring the rest of Slade's crew within the hour. There's an old line cabin 3 miles up the east draw. The miners abandoned it when the vein went dry. It's built of stone. The fire won't touch it, and it has got a single approach. By the time they reached the old stone cabin, the wind had died down, leaving the valley trapped in a thick, choking fog of gray smoke. Silas unhitched the horses and turned them into the small stone corral behind the shack, while Evelyn and Pete ushered the children inside. The cabin was small, dark, and smelled of old damp earth. There was no furniture left but a broken table and a rusted iron stove. But the walls were 3 feet of solid granite, and the heavy oak door had an iron bar across the inside. Evelyn sat on the floor, pulling the children close to her, checking their hands and faces for burns. Sarah was coughing, her little chest rattling. Evelyn reached into her apron, pulled out a small glass vial of cherry bark syrup she'd managed to save, and gave the child a spoonful. "Is the school gone, Miss Evelyn?" Sarah whispered, her eyes red from the smoke. "The logs might burn, darling," Evelyn said gently, wiping a streak of soot from the little girl's forehead. "But the school isn't the building. The school is what you have inside your head. Remember your letters. Capital A, capital B." The girl nodded, her small thumb slipping into her mouth. "B stands for brave." "That's right," Evelyn said, her voice soft but firm enough for every child in the room to hear. "And as long as you can remember those letters, nobody can take your education away from you. No truant officer, no mining company, no man with a gun. You are free because you can think." Silas stood by the narrow slit window, watching the trail approach. He had his Colt out, slowly wiping the grit from the cylinder with his thumb. He listened to her voice in the dark. It was the same rhythm when the sun was shining, and the slates were clean. "You really believe that, don't you?" Silas asked quietly, his eyes never leaving the dark trail outside. "I have to," Evelyn said from the shadows. "If I don't believe that a human being has inherent value under the law, then this whole territory is just a graveyard with a gold mine attached to it. My father didn't die a free man just so I could let Hiram Blackwood treat these children like iron ore." Silas didn't answer. He looked down at his own hand, the hand that had taken 30 lives in 30 different towns. For the first time, the weight of the iron didn't feel like a curse. It felt like a shield. "They're coming," Silas said suddenly, his voice dropping into that flat, deadly register through the narrow window. The fog was shifting. 3 riders emerged from the gray timber at the bottom of the draw, their horses moving at a cautious walk. At the front was Slade, his hand wrapped in a thick, bloody white bandage, his remaining fingers gripping a heavy carbine. Thorn Slade's voice echoed up the canyon. thin and raspy through the smoke. "We know you're in there. Blackwood says he'll give you $500 gold to walk away right now. Leave the woman and the ledger, and you can ride to Montana with your pockets full." Silas didn't look back at Evelyn. He didn't have to. He could hear her breathing in the dark behind him, steady, regular, and completely devoid of surrender. He leaned his face closer to the stone slit. "I told you before." "Slade," Silas called out, his voice cutting through the damp fog like an axe through pine. "Don't touch her. And tell Hiram Blackwood I'm done running from his ghost." He pulled the hammer back on the Colt. The sharp, double click was the loudest sound in the stone room. "Let's find out," Silas muttered to the dark trail. "How much your gold is worth when the lead starts flying." The granite walls of the line cabin kept the heat of the fire outside, but they couldn't keep out the damp chill of the mountain fog. Inside, it was dark. A single tallow candle sat on the floor in the corner, its tiny flame flickering every time the wind found a crack in the mortar. Silas stood by the narrow slit window, his body motionless. The Colt .45 was back in his holster, but his right hand remained loose, fingers hovering just an inch above the walnut grip. Out in the draw, Slade and his two scouts had pulled back into the timberline. They weren't riding away. They were waiting. A smart predator didn't rush a stone fort. It sat in the brush and waited for the meat inside to run out of water. "They're settling in," Silas said. His voice was a low rasp, cutting through the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping children. Evelyn walked over to him. Her footsteps were light, almost silent on the packed dirt floor. She carried a tin cup of tepid water and handed it to him. "Drink, you rebreathing ash." "Silas," he took the cup, his rough fingers brushing hers. He swallowed the water slowly, letting the moisture soothe his burning throat. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the black shapes of the pine trees outside. "Your side is bleeding again," she said softly. She reached out, her palm resting gently against the torn canvas of his coat, right over his ribs. She could feel the hard, jagged ridge of the scar tissue under the shirt. "You took a hard knock down at the creek. It's just an old debt-paying interest," Silas muttered. He shifted his weight, wincing slightly as the muscle caught. "I've had worse holes than this." "That doesn't mean you have to keep digging them," Evelyn said. She didn't pull her hand away. "You told me about Wyoming." "Silas, you told me what the Goldmen did to your home, but you never told me how you survived the fire." Silas went stiff for a long moment. The only sound in the cabin was the wind whistling through the stone slit. The memory came at him like a physical blow, the smell of kerosene, the orange roar of the flames, the terrifying weight of the timber crashing down on his life. "I didn't survive it," Silas said. His voice dropped into a register, so low it was almost a whisper. "The man who wore the star. The man who used to believe that a piece of paper in a courthouse could keep a family safe. He stayed in that burning house. The thing that crawled out was just a shadow." He turned his head slowly, his gray eyes meeting hers in the dim starlight. "I was out in the northern hills tracking a horse thief when it happened," he said, the words coming out hard and dry, like gravel. "Hiram Blackwood Land Syndicate had bought the local judge. They wanted the water rights on my valley. My wife, Clara, she had the deeds. She knew the law. She stayed at the house because she believed the law would protect her. She thought a sheriff's badge on her husband's chest meant something." He stopped. He took a ragged breath, his chest heaving against his wounded ribs. "They didn't even use lead," Silas whispered. "They just barred the shutters from the outside and threw the torches. When I rode into the yard at dawn, the chimney was the only thing left standing. My boyish little tin soldier was melted into the porch stone." Evelyn's breath hitched. She reached up with her other hand, her fingers gently cupping his bearded cheek. Her hand was warm, trembling slightly with a deep, sorrowful empathy. "Oh, Silas, I spent 4 years hunting the men who signed those orders," Silas said, his jaw tightening under her palm. "I found 3 of them in Kansas. I found 2 more in Colorado. I didn't ask them for a trial. I didn't show them a warrant. I just showed them the caliber of my lead. I thought if I killed enough of them, the screaming in my head would stop. I thought I could buy back my soul with blood. He looked down at her hand against his face. The contrast was sharper clean. Honest skin against his scarred, weathered flesh. But it don't work that way, Silas murmured. Every time I pull that trigger, the smoke just gets thicker. I came to Deadwood because Blackwood was the last name on my list. I didn't come to save your school, Evelyn. I came to put Hiram in the dirt and let the law bury me next to him. Evelyn looked at him, her dark eyes wide and swimming with tears. But behind the tears was that same unyielding wall of iron he'd seen on the schoolhouse porch. The men who burned your house were beasts, Silas, she said, her voice steady and clear. They rejected the law because they wanted power. If you solve their evil with more murder, then they win. They turn you into them. They already turned me, he muttered. No, Evelyn said fiercely, her fingers gripping his jaw, forcing him to hold her gaze. An animal kills because it is hungry or afraid. You stood in my yard, and you disarmed those men. You didn't kill Slade when you had the draw. You chose control. You chose to protect life instead of just taking it. That isn't a shadow, says Thorne. That is a man. She stepped closer, her forehead resting against his shoulder, her breath warm through his coat. The law isn't a magic spell. Silas, she whispered into the dark, it's a human agreement. It only works if good people are willing to stand up and hold the scales. Even when the wicked try to tip them with gold, you used to carry a star. You used to understand that the true purpose of power isn't to destroy, but to shield the innocent. Your family didn't die, so you could become a murderer. They died because the world didn't have enough men like the man you used to be. Silas stood perfectly still. Her words felt like vinegar on an open wound, sharp, burning but somehow clean. The cold, heavy knot of hatred that had sat in his belly for 4 years didn't vanish. But for the first time, it felt like a choice rather than a curse. You're a powerful speaker. Evelyn, he whispered, his large hand slowly rising to cover hers against his cheek. I'm a school teacher, she said, looking up at him with a faint, brave smile. It's my job to make sure the lesson sticks. Behind them, in the shadows, little Toby stirred. He sat up under his blanket, rubbing his eyes. He looked at the 2 adults standing by the window, then looked toward the heavy oak door. Miss Evelyn, Toby called out softly, is the bad man still out there? Evelyn let go of Silas and walked over to the boy, kneeling down on the dirt floor beside his blanket. She pulled him close, her arms wrapping around his narrow shoulders. He's out there, Toby, but he can get inside. This house is made of stone. He wants to make us slaves again, doesn't he? Toby asked, his voice cracking with an old, institutional fear, like the men in the dark holes. He wants to try, Evelyn said, her voice rising so that all the children who were now waking could hear her. But a man cannot be enslaved if he refuses to accept the Master S chain in his mind. Toby, look at me. The boy looked up at her. What did we learn yesterday about the law? She asked. The law says we have rights, Toby muttered. The law says every person is born free under God. That's right, Evelyn said, her hand resting on the boy's chest, right over his heart. And that freedom doesn't belong to Hiram Blackwood. It doesn't belong to the governor, and it doesn't belong to the men with the guns. It belongs to you. It has an inherent right. That means it was given to you the moment you drew your first breath, and nobody can trade it, sell it, or buy it unless you let them through fear. We stay here. We protect the papers, and we tell the truth. That is how we fight them. Toby nodded, his small shoulders straightening. He looked past Evelyn toward Silas, who was still standing by the window. The boy didn't see a ghost anymore. He saw a shield. Silas turned back to the window slit. The fog outside was starting to turn a pale, cold gray. Dawn was coming, and with the dawn, the waiting would be over. By noon, the smoke in the draw had settled into a low, greasy haze that smelled of sulfur and wet coal. Silas hadn't moved from the window. His legs were stiff, his side throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache, but his eyes were sharp. He watched the timberline. Every 20 minutes, he'd see the flash of a horse's tail, or the reflection of the pale sun against a metal rifle barrel. Slade was gathering his men. The scouts had gone back to the mines and brought reinforcements. "There's 8 of them now," Silas said, his voice flat. He didn't turn around. "They brought 3 more from the lower camp. They've got heavy repeating rifles." Pete sat by the cold iron stove, a greasy rag in his hand, as he ran a cleaning rod down the barrel of Evelyn's father's old 12-gauge. 8 guns against a stone wall ain't bad odds. "Silas, we got plenty of lead, and the door is 3 inches of solid oak. They aren't going to rush the door." "Pete," Silas said, his eyes narrowing as he saw a rider move out from the trees. It was Slade, his hand still wrapped in that bulky white bandage. But he was carrying a long, heavy wooden box across his lap. They brought grease, and they brought blasting powder from the mine. Evelyn stood at the small table, her fingers sorting through the stacked pages of the Rogue newspaper. She didn't look at the window. She kept her focus on the rows of black type. "If they blow the door, they destroy the evidence. Silas, that's what Hiram wants. He don't care about the land anymore. He cares about the secret. Then we don't let them get to the door," Silas said. He turned around, his movements deliberate, his gray eyes fixed on Evelyn. "Elias, how many sheets do we have ready?" 42, the preacher said, from the back corner, his apron still stained with the black printer's ink. 42 copies of the truth, completely documented. Every name, every debt figure, every illegal contract. "It is enough," Silas said. He walked over to the table and picked up the heavy leather satchel. He began slipping the dried papers into the pocket inside. "Pete, you take the children through the old air shaft in the back wall. It leads into the dry creek bed behind the cabin. It is narrow, but the kids can slide through. You take them down to the willow patch and wait, and leave you here alone," Evelyn asked, stepping into his path, her eyes flashing with anger. "I won't be alone, Evelyn," Silas said softly. "I'll have my iron, and I'll have the satchel." "No," she said, her hand gripping the leather strap of the bag. "We go together. You're still wounded. Silas, you try to run the ridge alone, with 8 shooters tracking you, and they'll find you before you make the mile." "She's right, Silas," Elias said, stepping forward. He had a heavy iron pry bar in his hand, the tool he used to set the type frames. "I'm a man of God, but the Lord gave me these shoulders for a reason. I stay with Silas and cover the front door. You take the kids and the papers." "Evelyn, nobody is leaving the papers," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into that cold, clear tone that brooked no argument. "The papers are the only reason any of us are still breathing. If Blackwood kills us and burns the leather bag, then Carl Schmidt stays a slave in that hole forever. My father didn't build this ranch to let a mining baron win, because we were too afraid to carry the truth into the daylight." She looked at Silas, her face just inches from his. "We fight as a school." "Silas," she said, her voice a fierce whisper, "we fight together. Every human soul in this room has the exact same right to survive this night. We don't trade one life for another. That is Blackwood's arithmetic, not ours." Silas stared at her. He could hear the first dull thud of a horse's hoof coming up the trail outside. Slade was moving. The time for talk was gone. He looked at Elias, then at Pete, and finally back at the small, fierce woman standing before him. "All right," Silas said, his hand dropping to the butt of his Colt. "Pete, get the kids into the shaft. Now." The children didn't cry. Toby went first, sliding his narrow shoulders into the dark, jagged hole in the granite foundation, where the old miners used to haul out the waste rock. Sarah followed, her small hand catching Evelyn's apron for a fraction of a second before she disappeared into the stone. Boom! The first rifle shot struck the heavy oak door, the lead ball buried deep in the thick wood, sending a shower of white oak splinters into the room. Thorne, Slade's voice roared from the yard. We relighting the grease. You've got 30 seconds to throw out the bag, or we cook you inside. Silas stepped to the window slit, his Colt leveled. Through the smoke, he saw two men running toward the porch, carrying a heavy canvas sack soaked in black mine grease. They had a burning pitch pine torch between them. Bang! Silas pulled the trigger. The bullet caught the torchbearer square in the thigh. He stumbled, the burning pine tumbling from his hand and igniting the grease sack instantly. A massive, roaring sheet of oily black fire exploded across the porch steps, the heat radiating through the stone wall like an open furnace. The roof. Pete yelled from the back of the room. The cedar shingles are catching. Above them, a low, ominous crackling started. The dry wood of the rafters, baked by years of mountain sun, was taking the fire from the porch awning. Thick, yellow smoke began to leak through the cracks in the ceiling, filling the small room with a choking, blinding fog. Elias, move, Silas shouted, coughing as the smoke hit his lungs. Through the shaft. Pete, take Evelyn. I'm not leaving without the satchel. Evelyn screamed through the haze. She was on her knees by the table, her hands blindly sweeping the loose pages into the leather bag through the blinding smoke. A heavy boot slammed against the front door. The wood groaned. The iron bar, bending under the weight of a mining timber, being used as a battering ram. Thud, thud. The bar is giving, Elias yelled, his massive shoulders wedged against the granite wall as he helped the last child, a little boy named Joey, through the narrow air shaft. Evelyn, go. Silas didn't look back. He ran to the table, grabbed Evelyn by the waist, and hauled her off her feet, just as the front door exploded inward in a storm of fire, iron and splintered oak. Slade stepped through the burning frame, his face twisted in a mask of soot and pure, murderous rage. He raised his short-barreled carbine, his eyes fixing on the leather satchel in Evelyn's hand. Die, you bitch, Slade screamed. Silas didn't think. He didn't calculate. He threw his own body squarely in front of Evelyn, his left arm wrapping around her head to shield her from the blast, while his right hand brought the Colt up by pure instinct. Bang, boom. The two shots fired at the exact same instant, the sound deafening inside the small stone walls. Silas felt a hot iron rod drive straight through his left shoulder, the force of the carbine ball spinning him around and crashing him into the dirt floor. But his own bullet had found its mark. Slade stumbled backward, his carbine clattering against the stones, his chest collapsing as he fell through the burning doorway into the greasy fire on the porch. Silas, Evelyn cried, dropping the satchel and throwing herself onto his chest. Her hands were immediately slick with his blood hot, fresh, and flowing from the new hole in his shoulder. Go, Silas rasped, his eyes struggling to focus through the yellow smoke. The ceiling above them was a solid sheet of roaring orange fire now, the pine rafters starting to sag under the weight of the stone chimney. The shaft, Evelyn. Take the kids. I'm not leaving you. Silas Thorne, she yelled into his face, her voice cutting through the roar of the flames like a trumpet. She grabbed him under the arms, her small boots digging into the dirt floor as she strained with every ounce of her strength to drag his heavy frame toward the back wall. Elias was there a second later, his large hands grabbing Silas' boots, helping her haul him through the choking dark. They slid him into the narrow air shaft just as the main roof beam crashed down onto the table, smashing the printing press frames into 1,000 molten pieces. They crawled through the cold, damp stone tunnel, the air gradually turning sweet and cool as they emerged into the dry creek bed behind the cabin. The children were there, huddled in the willow brush, Pete standing over them with the 12-gauge leveled at the ridgeline. Silas lay in the gravel, his chest heaving, his face white as bone under the gray ash. He looked up at Evelyn, who was already tearing a strip from her own skirt to bind his bleeding shoulder. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was set. "The press is gone," Silas whispered, his voice cracking with a deep, bitter defeat. "The type, the ledger, everything." Evelyn stopped her hands. She reached down into the gravel, picked up the heavy leather satchel that she had dragged through the tunnel with her teeth, and laid it across his chest. "The press was just iron, Silas," she said, her dark eyes looking down at him with a fierce, beautiful clarity. "But the truth is right here. 42 copies. 42 declarations of freedom. That S-42 lives that Hiram Blackwood can never buy back again." She tightened the bandage around his wound, her fingers warm against his skin. "We have the names," she said, looking back toward the burning cabin where the black smoke was rising into the Dakota sky. "And tomorrow, the whole territory is going to read them." The rain started just before midnight. It wasn't a clean, washing rain. It was a miserable mountain drizzle that turned the gray ash in the creek bed into a greasy, black paste. Silas lay propped against a mossy boulder under the willow canopy. His left arm was bound tight to his chest with strips of Evelyn S. linen apron. The new wound in his shoulder felt like a hot iron spike was driven through the joint, humming in sync with the old ache in his ribs. Every breath tasted like wet smoke. Beside him, Pete was cleaning the mud from the 12-gauge stock with a dry leaf. "They're gone, Silas," Pete whispered, his voice low and dry. "I scouted up to the cabin ruins. The fire is mostly down to embers. Slade body is still on the porch steps, but the others pulled back. They took the horses." Silas didn't answer. He looked at Evelyn. She was sitting 3 feet away, the heavy leather satchel gripped tightly in her lap. She wasn't crying. Her face was as pale as the mountain mist. Her jaw set so hard the muscles in her cheek twitched. She was watching little Joey and Sarah sleep under a shared blanket. "Where is Toby?" Silas rasped. His throat felt like a gravel road. Evelyn didn't look up. "He went with Elias to find the horses we turned loose in the draw. They should have been back by now." A twig snapped in the dark. Pete swung the 12-gauge around by pure instinct, the heavy hammers clicking back in the quiet air. "Don't shoot," a voice called out. It was Elias. The tall preacher stumbled through the willow brush. He didn't have the horses. His dark frock coat was torn at the shoulder, and his gray beard was matted with dried blood. He was alone. Evelyn stood up so fast, the leather satchel tumbled into the wet gravel. She caught Elias by the arms. "Where is he? Where is Toby?" Elias looked down at the mud, his massive shoulders, the ones he'd used to haul Silas out of the fire, were slumped in a terrible, heavy defeat. They were waiting by the North Spring, Miss Evelyn. 3 of Blackwood's camp guards. They had repeating rifles. I tried to hold them off, but one of them caught me with a rifle butt to the temple. He took a ragged breath, his voice trembling. "They took the boy," Elias whispered. "They left this pinned to a willow trunk." The preacher handed Evelyn a crumpled scrap of ledger paper. Silas watched her face as she read it by the faint, gray light of the mountain dawn. The anger in her eyes didn't flare. It turned cold, freezing into something deadly. "Read it," Silas said. Evelyn's voice didn't shake. She the words plain and clear, like she was delivering a lesson to an empty room. To the school teacher, "You have 6 hours to bring the leather bag and the signed deed to the Blackwood Mine main office. Bring the gunslinger irons too. You come alone, or the black boy goes into the deep shaft with the rest of the loose rock. The choice is yours." The creek bed went completely silent, save for the patter of the rain on the willow leaves. "He is bargaining with a child's life," Elias said, his fists clenching until his knuckles cracked. "It's the same thing he does in the mines. He finds the thing you love, and he puts a price on it. He thinks everything has a price," Evelyn said. She picked up the leather satchel from the mud and wiped the moisture from the strap. She looked at Silas. "He thinks because he has the gold and the guards, he owns the arithmetic of this valley. He thinks I'll trade Tobias' life for these papers." Silas leaned his head back against the boulder. "Will you?" Evelyn walked over to him. She knelt in the mud, her dark eyes inches from his gray ones. A human life cannot be traded. Silas, not for land, not for money, not even for the truth. If I give him these papers to save Toby, Blackwood wins because he proved that fear is the ultimate law. If I keep these papers and let Toby die, Blackwood wins because he turned me into a monster who values ink more than a childish breath. She reached out, her fingers brushing the grip of the Colt .45 resting in Silas's lap. We don't accept his choices, she said, her voice dropping into a fierce, quiet whisper. We make our own. You can't walk into that camp alone. Evelyn, Silas said, Hiram won't just take the papers. He'd bury all of you in the dark, where the law can't find the bones. I am not going alone, she said, looking at the gun. I'm going with the sheriff. Silas looked down at his bound arm. He tried to move his fingers, but the pain in his shoulder made the world go white for a second. He let out a long, slow breath. The sheriff in Deadwood is Blackwood's cousin. Evelyn, he ain't gonna help you. I'm not talking about the man with the tin badge in town, she said, her fingers tightening around his hand. I'm talking about the man sitting right here, the man who told me that protecting life is what makes you human again. You used to wear a star. Silas Thorne. You told me the smoke cleared when you saw me stand by that door. She stood up, pulling the leather satchel over her shoulder. Elias, stay with the children, she ordered. Pete, hitch the one mule we have left to the small cart. We're re-going to the Blackwood mine. Silas closed his eyes. The pain in his body was a roaring furnace. But underneath the pain, the cold, heavy knot of hatred was gone. In its place was something else, a quiet, steady pulse. The heartbeat of a lawman who had finally found his way out of the smoke. Pete, Silas called out into the rain. Get my iron and find me a stout branch. I'm gonna need a crutch if we re-going to a meeting. The Blackwood Mine main office sat at the mouth of the canyon like a heavy, wooden toad. The building was surrounded by hills of black tellings, the dead rock pulled from the earth by the men who weren't allowed to leave the dark. A dozen ore wagons sat idle in the red mud, their iron wheels caked in grease. The air here didn't smell like pine or rain. It smelled like sulfur, wet coal, and the heavy, sour sweat of forced labor. Hiram Blackwood sat behind a massive mahogany desk inside the office. He was a large man, dressed in a black wool suit that didn't have a speck of mud on it. His fingers were long, clean and decorated with 3 gold rings. Beside the desk, Toby stood with his hands tied behind his back. The boy had a dark bruise on his cheek, but his chin was up. He was staring at the wall map of the mining claims. The heavy oak door swung open. Evelyn Vance walked in first. Her green dress was torn at the hem, her apron stained with black printer's ink and the red dirt of the draw. But she walked with her head high, the leather satchel gripped tightly in her right hand. A step behind her came Silas. He leaned heavily on a rough pine crutch, his left arm bound to his chest, his face white as lard under his dark beard. His right hand hung loose at his side, the Colt .45 visible beneath his torn duster. 2 of Blackwood's camp guards stepped inside behind them, their repeating rifles leveled at Silas's back. Miss Evelyn, Hiram Blackwood said. His voice was smooth, like oil on water. He didn't get up. He just gestured to a wooden chair across from the desk. I'm glad to see you are a sensible woman. I was worried. The schoolhouse fire might have clouded your judgment. My judgment is perfectly clear. Hiram, Evelyn said. She didn't sit down. She walked straight to Toby, her hand resting on the boy's head for a fraction of a second. You have the papers you wanted. Release the boy. The papers first. Miss Vance, Hiram said, holding out a large, clean hand and the deed to Hope Ranch, signed in ink. The land belongs to the children. Blackwood, Evelyn said clearly. Her voice carried through the open windows to the rows of silent miners who were gathering in the mud outside. It was deeded to them by my father under United States law. You can't buy it, and you can't take it through intimidation. Every person in this territory has a right to property, and every child has a right to a home that isn't a hole in the ground. Hiram Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. The law belongs to the men who can pay the surveyors. Sweetheart, this territory needs gold, not orphans who can recite the alphabet. Now give me the satchel, or the boy goes down the shaft. One of the guards stepped forward, his hand catching Toby by the collar. Don't touch him, Silas said. The room went dead quiet. The two guards behind Silas chuckled a low, nasty sound. They looked at the crippled drifter, his arm bound, his body leaning on a pine stick. You're a long way from Wyoming. Thorn, Hiram Blackwood said, leaning back in his leather chair. Slade told me about you before he died. Said you used to be a sheriff. Said you were looking for a grave. I can accommodate that. Hiram nodded to the guards. The men laughed louder. They raised their rifles. And then the shooting started. It didn't happen the way the outlaws expected. Silas didn't try to draw from his hip. He didn't drop the crutch. With a movement too fast for the eye to follow, Silas tilted his weight, using the pine crutch as a pivot. His right hand came out from beneath the duster. The Colt .45 already, roaring before the guards could even clear their sights. Bang! The first guard's rifle shattered in his hands, the iron receiver exploding into white sparks. The force of the blow lifted him off his feet and threw him through the glass window behind him. Bang! The second guard cried out, his pistol tumbling into the mahogany desk as a bullet tore through his wrist. He fell to his knees, clutching his arm, blood pooling on the clean wood. Hiram Blackwood scrambled backward, his leather chair tipping over, as he reached for a small silver-plated revolver inside his desk drawer. Evelyn, down, Silas shouted, his voice a roaring command that echoed through the small room. Evelyn didn't run. She grabbed Toby by the vest and threw her own body over the boy, pulling him down behind the heavy iron safe in the corner of the office. Bang, bang. 2 bullets from the yard outside tore through the wooden walls, showering the room with pine splinters. Hiram's mining guards were firing from behind the ore wagons. Silas stood in the center of the room, his back against the brick chimney. He didn't have his crutch anymore. He was leaning his weight against the solid brick, his right hand steady as stone as he leveled the Colt through the broken window. Bang! A shooter behind a wagon wheel slumped into the red mud, his rifle clattering against the iron rim. Thorn! Hiram Blackwood screamed from behind his overturned desk. His voice had lost its smooth oil. It was high, shrill, and full of the panic of a man who had suddenly discovered that his gold couldn't buy off a bullet. I'll give you $10,000. $20,000. You can have the ranch. Just let me leave. Silas didn't look at the desk. He kept his eyes fixed on the yard outside. The miners, hundreds of them, their faces black with coal dust. Their clothes rags were stepping out from the shafts. They weren't running away from the shooting. They were standing in the mud, watching the office door. The money won't buy back the names. Hiram, Silas called out, his voice cutting through the sulfur smoke inside the room. Carl Schmidt is out there. Hans Miller is out there. They've been reading the papers Evelyn printed. They know what you owe them. Through the window, Silas saw a tall, broad-shouldered man in a torn wool coat step forward from the crowd. It was Carl Schmidt. He had a heavy iron pickaxe in his hand. He looked at the fallen guard in the mud, then looked up at the office. Is it true? Carl shouted, his German accent thick and heavy across the yard. The paper says the contract is a lie. The paper says we are free men. Evelyn stood up from behind the safe. She stepped to the broken window, her face smudged with soot, the leather satchel open in her hand. She pulled out a handful of the rogue newspapers and threw them through the broken glass into the wind. The white sheets scattered across the mud, drifting into the hands of the waiting miners. It is true, Carl, Evelyn yelled, her voice ringing across the canyon like a church bell. The law of this country says you own your own labor. It says no man can hold you through fraud. Read the numbers. You don't owe Hiram Blackwood a single cent. He owes you your freedom. The miners looked down at the white pages. Some of them couldn't read the words. but those who could began to recite them aloud to the others. A low rumbling sound started in the crowd, the sound of hundreds of men, realizing that the chains they'd been carrying were made of nothing but fear and ink. Hiram Blackwood looked out at his workers through the gap in his desk. His face went gray. He raised his silver pistol, his hand shaking so violently the barrel rattled against the mahogany. "They re my property," he whispered. "I bought them." Silas stepped out from the chimney. He walked slowly toward the desk, his boots crunching on the broken window glass. He didn't raise his gun. He just looked down at the mining baron with his cold, gray eyes. "No, Hiram," Silas said softly. "You didn't buy them. You just forgot that under the sun. A man is a man, and the shooting is over." The federal marshals arrived from Cheyenne 3 days later. They didn't come with gold. They came with legal warrants signed by the territorial governor. They rode into Deadwood with 20 armed men, their blue wool coats clean against the red mud of the mining camps. Hiram Blackwood and his remaining guards were led out of the main office in iron shackles. The mining baron didn't look at the crowd of townspeople who had gathered on the boardwalks to watch him go. His silk vest was stained with coal dust, his gold rings confiscated as evidence of fraud, as the wagon carried him away. The townspeople didn't cheer. They just stood there, watching in a strange, heavy silence. The silence wasn't the old enemy anymore. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a community that was finally learning how to look each other in the eye. At Hope Ranch, the rubble of the old schoolhouse was still smoking, but the stone cellar remained intact. Silas Thorne sat on the porch steps of Evelyn's cabin. His left arm was still slung, but the white-hot pain had turned into a dull, manageable ache. He was using a pocket knife to whittle a fresh piece of cedar wood, shaping it into the small, square form of a toy soldier. Evelyn walked out of the house, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. She had changed into a clean blue dress, her hair pinned neatly back from her face. She sat down beside him on the rough wood, her skirts settling around his boots. "The marshals unlocked the bank accounts this morning," she said, handing him a cup. "Every miner who was held in the lower camp is being paid their back wages under the true ledger figures. Carl Schmidt is buying a farm down by the river trail." Silas took a sip of the coffee, the hot liquid warming his chest. "What about the school?" "We start rebuilding tomorrow," she said, her eyes fixed on the green draw where the children were playing by the creek. Toby was there, leading the mule by the halter, his laughter echoing through the pines. Reverend Elias found a freight driver from Sioux City who is willing to bring us a new press by winter. A larger one this time. She turned her head to look at Silas. The midday sun caught the amber flecks in her eyes, making them look bright, clear, and full of a beautiful, unyielding light. "The marshal asked me about you, Silas," she murmured. "He saw the signature on the ledger report we sent to Cheyenne. He knows you used to wear a star in Wyoming." Silas didn't stop his knife. A long curl of cedar wood fell to the porch floor, smelling of sweet sap. "The star belongs to a dead man, Evelyn." "He don't think so," she said, reaching out to cover his right hand with her own. Her fingers were warm, steady, and solid. "He says the territory needs a circuit judge who can't be bought, and a marshal who knows how to keep the peace without turning into a beast. He wants you to take the oath again." Silas stopped the knife. He looked down at her hand against his. For 4 years, his fingers had only known the cold, hard weight of iron, and the greasy slide of black powder. But holding her hand made him feel the texture of the living world again, the reality of a tomorrow that wasn't a grave. "I'm a poor bookkeeper, Evelyn," he whispered. "I'm a school teacher," she said, a small, genuine smile breaking across her face. "I can teach you the arithmetic. It's simple enough when you start with the truth." She leaned in slowly, her forehead resting against his wounded shoulder. Silas didn't pull away. He let go of the knife and wrapped his right arm around her waist, pulling her close against his chest. He could hear the sound of Marcus's hammer echoing from the north fence line, the steady, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a home being built, one post at a time. The land around them was the same land. It had always been harsh, rocky, and indifferent to the struggles of the human souls, who tried to scratch a living from its dirt. But as the sun climbed high over the black teeth of the ridge, casting a long, golden light across the green valley, the valley didn't feel lonely anymore. In Deadwood, the papers were being read on every street corner. The names were being spoken aloud in the general store, in the saloon, and at the church steps. The true things were being said first, in black ink on white paper, by people who could read them. Silas closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of cedar sap and lavender soap. The fire in his head was completely out. The smoke had finally cleared, leaving nothing but the quiet, beautiful dawn of a new territory, and the woman who had taught him how to live in it. Every great Western story leaves us with more than memories of dusty trails, hard-fought battles, and dramatic confrontations. At its heart, this story reminds us that true strength is not measured by a person's wealth, power, or reputation, but by the choices they make when faced with hardship and injustice. Throughout the journey, we witnessed characters tested by betrayal, loss, fear, and difficult decisions. Yet it was courage, integrity, and perseverance that ultimately defined their legacy. The story teaches us that even in the harshest circumstances, people always have the opportunity to choose honor over greed, compassion over hatred, and truth over deception. Another powerful lesson woven into this tale is the importance of resilience. Life on the frontier was never easy, and neither is life in our own world. Obstacles, disappointments, and unexpected challenges are inevitable. However, the characters in this story demonstrate that setbacks do not have to determine our future. What matters most is the determination to keep moving forward, to stand back up after every fall, and to hold on to hope, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. Their struggles remind us that perseverance often leads to growth, wisdom, and ultimately redemption. The story also highlights the value of community and human connection. No one succeeds entirely alone. Whether through friendship, loyalty, family bonds, or unexpected acts of kindness, the characters discover that support from others can make the difference between despair and survival. In a world that often encourages independence above all else, this message remains timeless. We are stronger when we stand together, help one another, and build relationships based on trust and respect. Perhaps the most enduring message of all is that our actions create our legacy. Long after the dust settles and the conflicts are forgotten, people remember how we treated others and what principles we stood for. The heroes of this story were not perfect, but they chose to do what was right when it mattered most. Their example encourages us to live with courage, fairness, and compassion in our own lives. This journey comes to an end. We are left with a simple yet powerful truth. Every person faces crossroads that reveal their character. The choices we make in those moments shape not only our own destiny, but also the lives of those around us. May this story inspire us to face our challenges with courage, remain faithful to our values, and never underestimate the power of integrity, kindness, and perseverance. Those are the qualities that endure long after the final chapter has been written, and they are the true treasures hidden within every great Western tale. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.